Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Peter Haines from CCL Academy. We probably have a few more people to join us, but for those of you who've turned up at the advertised time, let's make a start and others can join us as they can. So welcome to this third in the SM&CR Briefing Series. We're going to be talking about conduct on the board for the next 30 minutes. Hopefully you are all muted, and one of my colleagues is carefully muting you all as we go through, as you join, so that we don't hear too much background noise. But please do unmute yourself and raise a question, a challenge. If you disagree with me, if you have anything to add, please do that. We also have, of course, the chat facility, so please do raise a question on the chat. And I will certainly stay around online for a good few minutes afterwards. If anybody wants to raise anything privately or semi-privately, we'll stop recording once the main session is finished, particularly if there are any private thoughts or private questions that people want to raise. So without further ado, we will begin. And what I really wanted to cover is 4 brief areas in this very quick briefing session. So the FCA's expectations regarding conduct and culture, how to instill a positive culture within your firms. We'll talk about some examples of cultural leadership, and also how the board should conduct itself to retain a positive culture. I will canter through because I have far too many slides for the time allocated. Anybody who's worked with me before will know that is not uncommon in my case. So, looking at the FCA's expectations regarding conduct and culture, first of all, we should say that I guess culture, governance and conduct to a large extent are inextricably linked. We see real crossovers between conduct and culture, and I think sometimes the FCA and probably all of us, we all struggle to say, well, maybe what's the difference in practical terms between culture and conduct? But I think culture is a very, very important part of corporate governance, as is conduct. So the 3 are inextricably linked as an opening statement. We also have a view from a gentleman called Andrew Bailey, who used to be the CEO of the FCA. He has a slightly more important job, some would say now, in running the country's economy effectively, along with Mr. Sunak. And he said, there's no such thing as an ideal organizational culture, and as a firm's culture is influenced by many different factors, we cannot prescribe what it should be, nor do we believe that every firm should have the same culture. Now, cynics would say that's the FCA doing what regulators always do, which is to say, this is what we want as an outcome. We won't tell you how to do it, but we will criticize you if you don't do it to our satisfaction. I think that's a little bit unfair. I don't want to defend the regulators too much, but I think that is slightly unfair to be so cynical. But what he also said, it's for firms to ensure that their desired culture is consistent with appropriate conduct outcomes. So here we start straight away with this link between culture and conduct. To identify the drivers of behavior within the firm and control the risks that these drivers create. So what is actually happening within a firm to create the right culture and the wrong culture? So Andrew Bailey started that discussion off by getting us to think about what actually creates our culture. And of course, we have the conduct rules. So having said there's a clear link between conduct and culture, there was an update around August 19. So this was before the implementation of SM&CR for investment firms, but 3 years after the implementation for banks and just before the insurance firms came in. And they did a Stocktake, and basically what they said was interviewees believe that staff generally understand the conduct rules, but our evidence suggests that firms have not always tailored their conduct rules training to staff's job roles, and firms are often using their own values to articulate how they bring the conduct rules to life. So that's a good thing, isn't it? What the FCA is saying is, actually, yes, conduct rules, they can be looked at in abstract. You must deal with integrity, due skill, care and diligence, all of this. But what they're saying is, what we like to see is people actually looking at conduct rules, which apply to virtually everybody in the organization, and saying, we like firms actually using their own values to give some meaning to the conduct rules. So that maybe is another nudge in the direction that the FCA is looking for us to go, is to say, what are your own values and how do they fit with the conduct rules? And how do the conduct rules apply in the context of your own firm's values? However, they did say there was insufficient evidence to be confident that firms have clearly mapped the conduct rules to their values. Now, one reason it might be difficult to map conduct rules to the values is because the values have not been articulated, haven't been thought about, don't exist. But where they do, what they're saying is the good firms talked about values and conduct rules in conjunction. What they didn't like to see was there was no real link between values and culture and the conduct rules. So again, I think that's another nudge in the direction of what the FCA expects us to do. And they said very clearly, the conduct rules are a critical foundation for firms' culture and the conduct of individuals. So people need to understand the rules, how they apply, but there's this critical link between culture and conduct, as we suspect. And perhaps the best work that the FCA has done, and to be fair, there are not too many pieces of work anywhere that are actually better than this in many ways, was the discussion paper 18.2 on culture and financial services, where the FCA not only collected a number of essays from learned people, academics, practitioners, other regulators, but they also made it clear what the FCA's own thoughts were. And what they've said very clearly is culture in financial services is widely accepted as a key root cause of the major conduct failings that have occurred within the industry in recent history, causing harm to both consumers and markets. So of course, two hot buttons, consumer harm and market integrity, damaged by the wrong culture. So for markets to work and firms to be successful, it's critical that they're seen as trustworthy, of course. But so they then start giving us a definition. So to make sense of culture from an FCA perspective, we start by defining it as the habitual behaviors and mindsets that characterize an organization. Now, is that enough for you to define culture? Probably not. But again, it's a nudge from the FCA in the direction that we need to go. They then repeat, we don't believe that there should be a one-size-fits-all culture. We don't prescribe what any firm's culture should be. Some people bemoan that fact. It's interesting how many people say they like outcomes-focused or principles-based regulation, but actually, sometimes they say, I really want to know what the FCA expects of us. It's so much easier if we just have a nice tick box of things that we have to do to say we comply. Well, dream on, I would say on that. You're not going to get the FCA giving us a nice little tick box approach to say, tick these 10 boxes and you've got the good culture. And I think, I don't think too many people really expect that. But you still do hear some moans from the industry saying, why can't they be more prescriptive? I think this is telling us why they can't be more prescriptive. But they have set out 5 conduct rules. And they say that sits at the heart of actually their whole conduct regime, but also at the heart of the senior managers and certification regime. And we should know that those 5 conduct rules are discussed when they go into to interview senior managers at firms. Not just senior managers, they are now the regulators. We probably all know this. Just in case you don't, they are actually saying, we wanted to talk to people at the sharp end. We're going to talk to people at the sharp end. And by the way, we'll do it on Thursday. Give us a list. And on Thursday morning, we will give you the people that we want to talk to. So you can't prepare them and coach them too much for these sessions. And we'll go and talk to them and say, what does integrity mean to you? What does due skill, care and diligence? What are good customer outcomes? What is treating customers fairly? And they will get an indication of the firm's culture from those responses. And they will be an unprepared or largely unprepared, unscripted, uncoached response as to what the culture is in a particular firm. It's not just the FCA that looks to define or nudge us in the right direction. The Banking Standards Board, Alison Cottrell, CEO, said in 2018, culture is often defined as the way things get done when no one is looking, although how things get done when everyone is looking or when only some people are looking is arguably just as relevant. But more formally and broadly, it refers to the collective assumptions, values, beliefs, and expectations that shape how people behave in a group. And these norms will help determine what's considered admirable, tolerable, or shameful within the group and the status of individual members. Little surprise, therefore, that culture change can be destabilizing and met with resistance. Now, let's all think of our own firms. Who actually determines what is admirable, tolerable, or shameful? Is it the group as a whole? Or is it the leadership of the group? And by the leadership, I mean board, maybe board stroke senior management. Senior management are there all of the time. The board, the executive members of the board will be there all of the time. The non-executive members of the board will not be there all of the time. So who is determining what's admirable, tolerable, and shameful? It probably is ultimately the board and senior management, with input from HR, with input from compliance, of course. So I think what we're saying here now is not only is culture something that's a little bit grey, but it actually refers to the collective assumptions, values, beliefs, and expectations. But also, it's probably down to senior management to determine what that culture is or how we react to the culture as it emerges when we see things that are admirable, tolerable, or shameful. And what we've seen, this is Tom Reeder from the LSE, part of DP 18.2 again. He says that there are a number of things that are important in managing risk. He talks about a culture of effective risk management, but he also talks about integrity, customer orientation, and results orientation. And that means ensuring rewards are commensurate to performance and not encouraging of poor behavior, which is a very important factor. If you look back at the last 15 years, maybe 20 years, 10 years before the financial crisis, or 8 years now before the financial crisis and the 12 years since, it's become absolutely clear that a number of practices which were very prevalent in our industry were based on people being rewarded purely based or largely based on performance, on financial results, on revenue generated, rather than on conduct, on customer satisfaction, on the basis of treating customers fairly and of being a good corporate citizen. Now, we've seen changes in that respect, and that maybe is one of the levers of good culture going forward. Levers, I meant Levers. One of the levers of good culture going forward. So how do we instill a positive culture? This comes from the FCA's second report on work undertaken to develop conduct risk frameworks. And they said, this we saw as being effective. So highly visible board and CEO sponsorship, engagement and participation, and senior executive leadership in program design, engagement and delivery. Now, remember we're talking conduct risk here, but if you bear with me in this clear link between culture and conduct, and hopefully I've been able to demonstrate that. So what we're seeing is the most effective programs were where the board and the CEO were clear in their sponsorship. That's great. Yes, of course I want you to do this. That's all very well, but also engagement and participation. So, and we have this awful expression of, you know, do you talk the talk and walk the walk? And I loathe that expression. I use it far too much because actually it's quite meaningful. And I feel dirty when I use it, but engagement and participation, walking the walk as well as saying this is important. In other words, senior management, will they say, yes, of course, treating customers fairly is really, really important. Oh, hang on, until we come to a very lucrative transaction. And then, well, of course, the customer, caveat emptor, customers can look after themselves, can't they? You know, that is bad leadership in terms of culture. So we also saw visible business-led ownership of the whole initiative. What the regulators saw that they didn't like was when everything in the conduct risk program was left to compliance, for example. Compliance officers are nature's heroes. We all know that. But then they cannot drive by themselves the culture of the organization. Or if they can, they are totally exceptional. So fully integrated training, promotion, performance management, and remuneration with conduct and culture objectives. So this is what they saw was good around culture and conduct. Less effective, programs where the COO, compliance, or another second line of defense unit is the primary driver, seeking to achieve buy-in from others. So in other words, the regulator is saying, I think very clearly, if you read between the lines, that a key way of instilling a positive culture is to show leadership at a senior management level. Leadership in everything that means, not just the sponsorship, not just agreeing with the message, not just saying things at town halls or however they articulate what they want to achieve, but by actually demonstrating that in what they do as well as what they say. So what they also said in DP 18.2 is, understanding the dynamics of culture facilitates progress, but firms' behavior will only transform for the better if change is chosen rather than imposed. And that again, I think that dictates that senior management leadership is important, because that way the firm is more likely to choose a positive culture rather than it being imposed by regulators, being imposed by third-party events, or just developing organically or naturally. If you show senior management leadership, it's more likely to be chosen by everybody in the firm, particularly if they think, do you know what? I actually believe in what this senior manager is saying. I don't believe they're indulging in hypocrisy, saying one thing and doing another. I believe that they mean what they say because I've seen it in action. I've heard that them backing that up by disciplining senior and very lucrative revenue generators when they behave wrongly, for example. But even though it needs to be chosen and show leadership, the focus on culture is the responsibility of everybody in the firm, and it should be a collaborative effort by all areas and at all levels. So I think that's what the FCA is saying. So how do we demonstrate this? How do we show leadership? And I occasionally do board evaluations. I used to do more than previously when I was doing more consultancy. Now I'm doing so much training. But occasionally I do board evaluations. And one of the questions that I will ask individual directors of the board and the board collectively is, does the board demonstrate the right culture? Does the board show leadership in culture and values? I can think of one institution that everybody will have heard of where they actually said, do you know what? We haven't actually written down our culture and values. We don't know, we haven't articulated them at all. I did a pre-regulatory review of one group, again, one you'll have heard of, a few years ago. And the first interviewee of over 50 interviewees doing mock interviews, I said, what is the culture? And he told me what the culture was, what the values of the firm. And I said to him, so how do you know that those are embedded within everybody within the firm? And he said, I just know they are. I just know they are. And at the end, he said to me when we were out of interview mode, he said, do you know, that was a really good question because we've never written them down, but I'm pretty confident that everybody understands the values. They're straightforward. And yeah, people know them. And I said, well, would you like me to prove it? Because I've got 50 people I'm interviewing. I'll ask them all that same question or those same questions. And I did ask them. And interestingly, of the 50 other people I interviewed, 49 of them gave me, in their own words, an articulation of the group's culture. One of them, when I asked the first question, what is the culture of the firm? He said, what do you mean? And when I said, what are the firm's values? He said, are you some sort of priest or something? And when we both stopped laughing and I told him, please don't do that in the actual interview with the regulators, he gave me a sensible answer. And I was able to say to the CEO, notwithstanding the fact that you've never actually written these down anywhere, I'm confident that the top 50 people in your organization know the culture. So if the top 50 people in your organization know the culture and show cultural leadership, I would be confident that everybody knows. So really interesting. But how visible and accessible are board members and senior management on points of value and culture? And the regulators, the FCA talks about the 4 levers of culture. So clearly communicating the sense of purpose, the what and the how, these are really important to getting the firm to work effectively. But think of the power and the effect of a well-communicated and resonant why. It's the tacit understanding shared by employees of a company's true purpose. Second is tone from the top, another cliche. What staff hear and see from senior management. So what are the behaviors that senior managers adopt to be a model to their employees? So this cultural leadership, again, is so important. This came from Jonathan Davison, one of our, I think, more sensible regulators. He expressed the third lever as the formal governance processes and structures, the policies and systems that specify expected behaviors and decisions. Now that can be sometimes a little bit too formalistic and don't always exist in that formal way within firms. But he says from a conduct culture point of view, we look for a well thought through conduct risk framework. If there's a clear exposition of conduct risks, the systems and controls for mitigating them and risk indicators for monitoring them. So that's what they're looking for. And there's a link really between culture and values on the one side, and on the other hand, the conduct risk framework, all centered around, of course, the 5 conduct rules that apply to virtually everybody in the firm. Finally, and I think this is really important, there are people-related practices, including incentives and capabilities. Remuneration, promotion, and recognition criteria all matter. So does a firm's pay structure reward misconduct? And is the pressure to turn a profit driving employees to act against consumer interests and against the culture and values of the organization? So those are the 4 levers of culture. The FCA will discuss those with you if they have any reason to talk about culture. And let's face it, if anything goes wrong in the firm, they'll say, first of all, what went wrong? Why did it go wrong? Who is to blame? And one of the follow-on questions will be, is this reflective of the firm's culture? Could it happen again? Do they see this as a systemic risk within the firm or even within the industry? So they will ask about these levers. They will ask about the conduct rules if they have cause to question culture. We're also, of course, seeing a lot of focus on accountability and leadership, primarily through the SM&CR. Focus on core values, focus on strategy. To what extent is culture, the values of the firm reflected in the strategy? Or do the values say one thing and the strategy says, okay, it's okay to rip off our customers? You know, I saw one strategic document that said, we have 3 different services which are quite distinct for 3 different types of customers. We are going to push all of our customers to take one particular service because it provides the greatest revenue to the firm. And the compliance officer, when I asked her to read it, she smiled and she said, that was 2 years ago, that document, and it's been fixed since. But wow, didn't that need a bit of cultural and conduct risk fairy dust spread over it? Which I thought was a wonderful expression. So we're also seeing have seen a huge emphasis on remuneration ever since the financial crisis. A lot has been done in that direction. And what we're seeing in the last couple of years is a lot more focus on non-financial conduct, including diversity. And we know, and I know as a board member, I received a letter because I'm currently, for some crazy reason, interim chairman of the institution. I saw a letter that said, tell us about your board diversity. What are you doing as far as board diversity is concerned? Give us comfort that going forward, any future hiring decisions at a board level will take into account diversity considerations. And I know one particular client that was approached by the regulator, the PRA, I think it was, and the PRA said to them, show me a picture of your board. And they didn't use the expression male, pale and stale. I hope nobody's offended by that. I am male, pale and stale, so I feel I can use it. But they basically said, looking at your board, everybody is of the same gender, same ethnic background, probably the same social background, probably the same sort of educational establishments. So everybody is going to be thinking in the same way, and nobody will challenge the status quo, because the status quo is what everybody has grown up with in that leadership group, in that board. So they're looking to diversity, not just gender diversity, but diversity generally. They're also looking at misconduct. And they said serious misbehavior like sexual discrimination, sexual misconduct, bullying is toxic to a working environment and can lead to bad outcomes for customers, staff, stakeholders and the firm. So in our view, tolerance of this sort of misconduct would be a clear example of a driver of unhealthy culture. Now, I know we as a training firm have done quite a bit and said quite a lot on non-financial misconduct. We bring it into our case studies for conduct training. And that just reflects the fact that the regulators are looking at this as part of the culture of the firm. If you can bully people, if you can sexually discriminate, racially discriminate, what does that say about the culture of the firm? And what does it say about how you would deal with your customers, for example? So how can the board conduct itself in the right way? People say that culture is contagious. Maybe good culture is contagious. We saw for a while that bad culture can be contagious. We saw an example such as LIBOR manipulation, FX manipulation, sales, mis-selling, should I say, of PPI. Everybody's doing it, so it must be okay. So I think bad culture can be contagious, but good culture is definitely contagious, particularly if it comes from that tone from the top. If the leadership in your firm are saying, this is what we expect of you, and your performance will be partially judged by the way you conduct yourself, not just by the way you make money for the firm, then that is absolutely crucial. So SMFs have got to lead by example. Remember, the FCA said conduct rules are a critical foundation for firms' culture. It's not just the general conduct rules, it's also the senior management conduct rules. So it's not just the responsibility of HR and compliance. We've established that. Everybody's responsible. Senior management are particularly responsible. And if you are a senior manager, you have responsibility for conduct in your firm. So senior manager, you are responsible for influencing your staff's conduct. So if senior managers are in meetings, and why not say, by the way, I remember you from last week, you did this with your customer. That is what we like to see in our firm. That is good. I will encourage that and congratulate you on that. So calling out good behavior as well as bad behavior is something that shows cultural leadership. So people need to know what good looks like in terms of culture. They need to know that from senior management. So senior management, I say you. If you're a senior management, you should be aware of specific cases of misconduct because, of course, as we know now, conduct rule breaches have to be escalated and potentially reported to the FCA under certain circumstances. So follow-up action remediation has got to be seen. So it's not just the good bit of promoting culture, saying this is really, really good, but we have to follow that through to take remedial action where people are not showing the values, the behaviors that we espouse, to which we aspire. And that involves also senior people and the star traders, the star fund managers. So these are the 5 conduct questions that the regulators will ask. They do ask these when they go into firms. So be aware of this. If you're a senior manager, be prepared to answer these questions. If you're a compliance officer or HR manager, again, make sure that your senior management are aware of these and can answer these questions effectively. So what does a good culture look like? We've talked about this. Tone from the top, communication, leadership, cultural leadership, strategy. Does your strategy incorporate culture, conduct, and customer centricity? Is the customer really at the center of everything that we do? Another cliche, but it's another important cliche. Is our remuneration aligned with the interests of customers, with the interests of good conduct? And do we apply our remedial and disciplinary action fairly and evenly? And of course, I would say this, don't underestimate the importance of training. We do conduct training a lot. We'll be doing a lot before the end of this year. What we've been able to demonstrate is that we actually get people thinking very carefully about what integrity means, what due skill, care and diligence means, what is right and wrong in their particular roles. It's thoroughly interesting training. You probably all know George Bartlett, who's our client relationship manager. If you want to talk about conduct training, talk to George. Here's the guy to talk to. I've talked for a long time, so thank you for listening. Does anybody have any questions, either on chat or out loud?